So I am Elizabeth Reese, and I'm one of the clergy at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. And we're gathered here with folks from other Episcopal churches in the region and other community members. At St. Paul's, our story, our way of coming into this is that many of us were involved in the Sacred Ground curriculum that came out of the Episcopal Church, an anti-racist curriculum that led us to thinking and learning and reflecting on the history of racism in the country that has been part and parcel of this country since the very beginning. And so many of us decided that we wanted to keep learning and be thinking specifically about what that looked like in our own city of Alexandria, how we saw systemic racism at work. And so we've been bringing in speakers from the city to talk to us about how that is present in health and housing and education. And tonight we are focusing on civil and criminal justice. So we will begin tonight by starting in prayer, as we always have. And I am going to add to our screen Reverend Joe Belser, who is the rector of Resurrection Church in Alexandria, which has just finished a pretty amazing project to create more affordable housing in Alexandria. So many thanks, Joe, for joining us tonight and being our prayer leader.
Sure. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
We pray to you, Father of justice, that you help each of us to learn to do good as you instructed. Come before you tonight seeking how you would have us be agents of your justice, a light for the world to see and know that you are God. As you told the prophet Isaiah, we ask that you give us first the stamina to stay focused on seeking justice for all people. Second, a double portion of wisdom and courage to reprove the ruthless. And finally, the heart to defend those who cannot defend themselves. We also ask for the grace to repent when we get it wrong. Historic murders of 3 teenagers, for example, in our city, Joseph McCoy in 1897, Benjamin Thomas in 1899, and Robin Gibson 4 days from today in 1970. The murder on this day a year ago of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The nearly 3,500 other African Americans and 1,300 whites who were summarily executed in our country by mob violence between 1882 and 1968 without due process of law, and the countless others who've been killed unjustly since 1968 by those representing the law. While we did ourselves personally commit these crimes, I acknowledge that we are heirs to this legacy, even while we may benefit unduly from the system this legacy upholds. Above all, we ask you to cure us of the thousands of other aggressions, macro, micro, and everything in between, against people of color that we have unknowingly committed or turned a blind eye to, which occur in our city every day. Help us to embody you in our world, to see all people as you see us, as beloved individuals, who are made in your image and loved beyond compare. We ask these things in Christ's name, the author of love. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you for that. And now I'm going to bring on Bob Wallace, who has been organizing this evening, and he's going to introduce our panel. Thank you, Bob, for all the work that you have done getting
Well,
this
thank
ready.
you. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks to St. Paul's for helping us put this together. We're very fortunate tonight to explore the 4th in the series of programs on systemic racism in Alexandria. And tonight's program deals with civil and criminal justice. The members of the panel are diverse and experienced in a rather unique way. We have this senior member, the Honorable Nolan Dawkins, Circuit Court Judge of Alexandria, retired, although he sits on cases even now. His personal journey as a both student and attorney in Alexandria is truly remarkable. and I hope he will be able to share some of it with us tonight. He was the first Black judge in Alexandria. He helped integrate the segregated schools of Alexandria. Was a student at George Washington High School, and he was a juvenile court judge and quite innovative in the efforts that he made to break down some of the inextricable connections between school truancy and prison. And as a circuit court judge, he continued in his efforts to make the judicial system fair and more humane. His partner as a juvenile court judge, now retired, is Steve Rideout, who sponsored reforms within the juvenile court system, initiatives such as the Alexandria Tutoring Initiative, efforts to reduce incarcerations of juveniles in our penal system, thereby allowing those students more freedom to progress without the stigma of a criminal record. The prosecutor with us tonight is the Commonwealth Attorney, Brian Porter, who will enlighten you as to what a Commonwealth Attorney is. Brian Porter is unique. He worked as a police officer. He has, in Alexandria, he came through the Commonwealth Attorney's office. He's now the head of that office. He is one of the founding members of Progressive Prosecutors of Virginia. And that group advocates very substantial reforms to the system to make the criminal justice system a fair and more equitable one, and to reduce the impact that it has traditionally had disproportionately on the Black and brown citizens. To give us the perspective that is quite essential to this whole discussion is Damon Colbert, a criminal defense lawyer in Alexandria and throughout Virginia, who has seen, as only a defense lawyer can, both the perspective of the client and how they interact with the system. And we look forward to Damon's perspective as to how reforms that affect both the judicial system and the police, incarcerations, and juvenile detention can transform Virginia, Alexandria going forward to be a fair and more equitable system. And as our moderator, we have someone who has both been a member of the St. Paul's vestry, but is a well-known journalist, author, and contributor to National Public Radio on a regular basis. He has programs and blogs that you will see come up through the Alexandria Gazette, the Packet, and on NPR. And he will be our moderator tonight. And his name is Michael Lee Pope. I think you probably have all come across him in your NPR listening and in your readings of the local papers. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael and let him proceed with the program. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Good. Okay. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to this panel discussion. I want to sort of start by setting the table here with the title of our program here, Exploring Systemic Racism in Alexandria Civil and Criminal Justice. I think before the murder of George Floyd last year, the phrase systemic racism wasn't necessarily at the top of our minds, wasn't really a discussion that many people were having. In our prayer, we talked about not turning a blind eye anymore. And with that in mind, I want to sort of start by giving our panelists an opportunity to kind of make opening statements by reflecting on systemic racism in civil and criminal justice. Sort of, what does that look like? What does that mean at the courthouse? Sort of like show us an image, show us the picture of that. So I would love to start with Judge Dawkins.
I'm sure that you would. Yeah, as I've said to the panel in our sessions prior to today, I'm very much focused on fairness. And I think that when we look at where we are in terms of the city of Alexandria, I think that we've had a very unique kind of experience in that we've had a good run with both the court system, and that's not to include me, but the court system, the judges, and how we have been able to create a dynamic within that system, which makes people walk into that room and walk into that courtroom and believe that there is a possibility that he or she can be treated fairly. And I think when we look at that, we have to look at not only the prosecutor has to make decisions about what he or she will decide to, how it's going to be charged. We have to look at the police officers in terms of when they'll make an arrest. We have to look at the defense attorneys. It's determining what is best in terms of their clients. So when we look at the whole scope of where we are in the city, I think that we've had a fairly decent run. Now, that run doesn't necessarily include all of the good, because obviously, in my case, I've had some downturns in my life, which would suggest that there were some personal issues that I had to deal with, and I think we start off with, obviously, as was noted, I was one of the first African Americans to attend and graduate from George Washington High School. Very interesting in having to do that. In fact, Brian Porter, who is the Commonwealth's attorney, and his father and I were great friends in high school. And but I was one of 5 who graduated from George Washington High School. And in order to go to that school, I had to make an application, not necessarily out of right, but because to see if I was qualified to be a part of that group. And I obviously, as it turns out, I graduated from George Washington, went on to undergraduate school in Ohio, went into the military, served in Vietnam, and ultimately became a city attorney in the city of Alexandria, and then became a juvenile judge with Steve Rideout. And then my final aspect of my career was when I became a circuit court judge. What has changed? Well, I'll tell you, everything has changed. There's not very much that I can say is any. I can only say that where we were 15, 20 years ago, we are not there anymore. But where we were 15 or 20 years ago, we are still there. And so many things have changed, and so many things are just the same. Nothing's changed. So to that extent, when we look at what we believe to be systemic racism, did I see it in my role as a lawyer? Did I see it in my role as a judge? Absolutely, I saw it, because absolutely it existed. And if anyone who is listening to me believes that it does not exist, I think you're in a hole, because racism exists very much so in this country and in this city. Mr. Poe, your turn.
Thank you so much for that, Judge. So I'm going to go to the other judge on our panel, Judge Rideout. I've never been on a panel with 2 judges before. This is pretty exciting. Judge Rideout, give us a sense. I think, as I said before, I think a lot of people hadn't really thought about, a lot of people at St. Paul's maybe hadn't really thought about the concept of systemic racism, how it affects our institutions. Take us inside of the courthouse and sort of how systemic racism is a problem in the Alexandria courthouse.
No, I have to thank you, Mike, and thank you for everybody who is joining us. I have to really go back to the 1990s and talk about what happened then when I went on the bench and when Judge Dawkins joined me in 1994. I have not been part of the court system or the courthouse since I retired from the juvenile court in 2004 and went on to do other things. So let me just talk a little bit about, in the early 1990s, the issue of overrepresentation of African-American children in the juvenile justice system was raised at a national level by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. In many jurisdictions, that caused finger pointing and denials that did not solve the problem of overrepresentation. It was something, however, that our Supreme Court urged us to address. It was not called systemic racism back then, as the term, as you have mentioned, has only recently come into common usage. During the late 80s and early 90s, the nation was gripped with significant challenges of crack cocaine. When I was appointed to the juvenile court bench in 1989, the response of the criminal justice system across the country to drug possession and sale was arrest them, prosecute them, and punish offenders to the fullest extent of the law. And I came into that with little experience of having been a substitute judge, but not doing these cases on a full-time basis. With juveniles involved in the sale of crack cocaine, the response locally was for us to transfer or move many of these children to the circuit court for trial as adults. We were overwhelmed with these and other case types. My typical court date began at 8 o'clock in the morning with preparation for the day's cases and often ended at or after 6 p.m. with little time for breaks or lunch during the day. Federal law also treated the possession and sale of cocaine differently and less harshly than the possession of the sale of crack cocaine. I recall, and some of you may recall, Tracy Fells, who was a local football hero for the T.C. Williams undefeated team, who received a 20-year federal sentence for his participation in illegal drug sales. The judge who sentenced him said that the heavy sentence was to, quote, send a message to the drug dealers. In juvenile court, in addition to working long days, we filled our regional detention homes to overflowing. The Alexandria sheriff had to transport youth down past Richmond and out to the far southwestern part of the state because of the overcrowding that we had here in Alexandria. I remember seeing data showing that our court was second per capita in the state for the transfer of juveniles in drug cases to circuit court for trial. This was before we were able to obtain the second position, and Judge Dawkins was able to join the court in 1994. I had a number of discussions with Lillian Brooks, who was our court service unit director, which does intake, probation, diversion of cases. And I concluded that there had to be better ways to address the challenges that our community faced, both with our criminal and delinquent caseload, as well as our civil caseload. And together, she and I decided that we'd try to find some of those solutions and bring in other people, other agencies, other members of the community to try to help us do that. In the mid-1990s, our court joined a national initiative sponsored by the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges called the Model Court Project. It was developed around the idea that the court and court service agencies should collaborate regarding our civil child welfare caseload to improve permanency outcomes for children, many of whom were African American. Within a few years of Judge Dawkins joining the court, we undertook 2 initiatives that impacted how we addressed our child welfare caseload that involved substance abuse and our juvenile truancy caseload. Both are essentially civil case types that involved a significant portion of African American children and families. Judge Dawkins led our family treatment drug court that had great success in helping parents to enter recovery and abstain from the use of drugs and alcohol so that their children could be returned to them, or if they failed to follow the program, that allowed us to move the children to other permanency options more quickly. Our Alexandria CASA program was a significant resource in that effort. It began in 1988, about a year before I started on the bench. As part of the Model Court Project, we participated in National Adoption Day that was started by the lead judge of the Los Angeles Model Court. It proved to be a great success in celebrating adoptions and encouraging social services staff to move their cases more quickly through circuit court once the children were freed for adoption. In the truancy arena, we worked for 9 years with the Alexandria Public School System, trying to have them address the high number of children we were seeing in our delinquency caseload that had missed too many days of school, that had never been addressed by the school system or brought to our attention. With a student body of over 10,000 children, for years we were seeing 10 truancy cases a year, most of which were brought to us shortly before the school year ended. In the late 1990s, Superintendent Herb Burke joined with Reverend Gary Charles of the Old Presbyterian Meeting House, Reverend Bert Ransom, our court in the faith community to start the Alexandria Tutoring Consortium to help those kindergartners and first graders to learn to read because they had not been having enough family involvement in their reading help prior to school. And St. Paul's was an important player in that effort. The program goal was to achieve on-grade level reading by the end of their second grade. Many of those children, again, are African American. And as many of you know, the Alexandria Tutoring Consortium continues even today. With the leadership of Dr. Bird, the child serving agencies in Alexandria came together to help us more effectively address the truancy cases. With a more effective referral system from the community to the court and a supportive school system, we went from having 10 cases a year to 300 a year the first year of our program and 400 the next year. And we were told that we could have had double that, except that there were not enough school and agency staff available to process all of those cases. My estimate is that up to 75% of those cases that Judge Dawkins and I heard involved youth who needed substance use or mental health treatment, and that we were able to order and that our agencies in the city were able to provide. This was a way that we were able to help divert children out of the system and get them the help that we wanted. As a result of these efforts, we saw our delinquency caseload drop in half, and the number of youth that we sent to the state custody go from around 70 to 90 a year when I first started to between 10 and 15 just before my retirement in 2004. With the issue of pre-adjudication detention, something that the Annie E. Casey Foundation was really interested in collaboration with our court service unit, we established alternatives to detention. While being conscious for the safety of the community, we found that too many youth looked at detention as a badge of honor. It gave them a reputation, maybe not well-deserved, but was well-known within the school system. We also wanted to help parents to regain control of their homes, so released many youth on conditions of release that were signed by both the parents and the child that allowed the parent to return the child for reconsideration of detention if the child failed to live up to the rules. We collaborated with the Alexandria Art League and the Department of Social Services to support children in foster care to create artwork that they hung in the hallway outside the courtroom. Our court service unit developed a variety of programs to intervene earlier with the family in an effort to prevent court involvement by youth. Those included community probation officers that worked away from the courthouse with youth on probation, as well as their brothers and sisters and parents, to help identify potential challenges in the family that available community services could help without court intervention. The court service unit also saw the growing need for girls programs for youth that would otherwise have headed to court because of inappropriate behavior in the community. From that came a program called Space of Her Own, developed by Linda Odell, that is working even till today, that has had great success in diverting girls from court involvement. Mike Mackey, who is now the Director of Court Services, began a mentors program in Alexandria that has helped immensely. A year or so before I retired, I learned about the Beat the Odds program of the Children's Defense Fund. I asked the Alexandria Bar and Bar Foundation to undertake an effort that they have done and continue to do and run successfully. It provides scholarships for youth that have been court involved and have turned their lives around. This past year, that program awarded $24,000 in scholarships to deserving youth. Finally, the Virginia legislature created the Comprehensive Services Act that required communities to come together through their agencies to collaborate in providing services to youth and families. It has proved to be very successful in Alexandria. I can't say that our focus on all these efforts was about systemic racism. I can't tell you that during those 9 years that we tried to have the school system address the truancy problems, that I ever heard any inappropriate racial comments by anyone in the school system. I can tell you, however, that the school system was very much aware from their own data and our discussions that their truant youth and our caseload in this area were primarily African-American children, and the resistance by the school system prior to Dr. Berg to taking any action to address the challenge was obvious. Our efforts were to address the challenges faced by the youth and families that we saw in court and were overrepresented by the African-American community in a more therapeutic way that might keep them from moving deeper into the juvenile and family justice systems. We were successful in some of this, but did we do it all? Simple answer, no. Looking back at our successes and challenges, there were, and I suspect there still are, ways that more could be done. The takeaway for me, and I hope for you, is that we were able to be successful because of you, the community, you, the agencies, you, the nonprofits, the people in the community that cared. And there are things you can do and are doing individually and that you can do as a congregation to help improve the lives of children and families in the city of Alexandria, no matter what their race. As the Comprehensive Services Act pointed out, those who need services are all of our children, and they need to be helped collaboratively by the available agencies, community programs, and residents of the city. I mentioned a few programs that we started or helped start here that are still going today, and I prepared and provided a short list to Elizabeth about initiatives that you can contribute to, or in some cases can volunteer for, that will not only benefit a child or a family and help change their lives, but will also change your life. As Mike Mackey says about mentoring, mentor a child, change 2 lives. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Judge. I really appreciate that. So we are now going to turn our attention to the, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Okay, good. Yeah, we're now going to turn our attention to the elected official on our panel, Brian Porter. He's got a title that's Commonwealth's attorney, which is a fancy way of saying prosecutor. If you watch Law and Order, they call him the DA. He's our DA here in Alexandria, which we sort of call the CA. You'll have to give him a pass if he sounds a little bit hoarse. I think he presented for 4 hours today, Brian, is that right? Did you say you spoke at this conference you're at?
Constitutional law for 4 hours today, Michael.
4 hours of constitutional law. Okay, well, we really appreciate you joining us after having done that today. So I'm asking to ask you the same question, Mr. Porter. Give us a look at systemic racism. This is a concept that is now we're really grappling with this, and paint us a picture of what systemic racism looks like at the Alexandria Courthouse.
Well, thank you, Michael. First of all, I want to thank the St. Paul's community for the opportunity and for the invitation tonight. It's very humbling to be part of a community conversation like this. This is as important as it is. It's also really humbling to be on a panel with so many distinguished colleagues in the legal profession. I'd start by saying that Damon Colbert has a reputation for being just an outstanding trial attorney and someone who cares very deeply about his clients. He's always been a very friendly person, from my understanding. and dealing with my people in my office, but also very firm and very sharp on his feet in defending his clients. And then obviously, both Judges Rideout and Judge Dawkins, just absolute Alexandria icons. Judge Rideout was on the bench when I was a very young prosecutor. I didn't have an opportunity to appear in front of him very often, but I can tell you that his impact on the JNDR court was and still is felt by everyone in the courthouse. And then Judge Dawkins, someone whom I have appeared in front of many, many times in my career, has really helped shape my understanding of what a lawyer is supposed to be, and how you're supposed to compose oneself, and how you're supposed to conduct your own actions in a courtroom. And so it's just really, I definitely feel like the weak link on this panel, but I do appreciate it, and I'm really very pleased to be part of such a esteemed and distinguished panel. And to answer your question, Michael, I think the way it's perceived, or the way one could perceive the impact of systemic racism in Alexandria, and probably in just about every courthouse across the United States, are the disparities in the racial breakdowns of the people that come before the court as criminal defendants. And I think it's very incumbent upon people like me in positions of some authority to understand and to admit and accept that there are disparities, that that's not some kind of anomaly, that that's actually par for the course. I will say that I think that the reasons for those disparities are very complicated, but there is no doubt that the system has in the past been used both to explicitly and overtly discriminate against people on the basis of race. Thankfully, that seems to be at least somewhat distant in the past, but not too far away. And then implicit biases continue to be a pervasive problem in the system. And so there's no doubt, if you were to go into a courtroom or a courthouse anywhere in the United States, you are likely to see racial disparities in the people that are before the court. I think there's other ways in which it can be perceived. Another way is that traditionally, the people that are active in the system tend to be white males. And I think it's very, very true, and I've always believed this, even as a young person involved in the system. I don't think there's going to be a lot of trust and understanding and a lot of belief that the system is fair from the people that appear in front of it until the system looks more like the people that appear in front of it. And I think we've made some strides with that in Alexandria recently, but there's still a lot of work to be done, no doubt about that. But before I address just kind of generally like, my philosophy and perhaps some of my policies as a prosecutor, I'd like to say just a little bit about my background. I don't frequently get a chance to speak to church groups like this. And so just everyone understands where I'm coming from. I was born and raised in Alexandria. As Judge Dawkins said, my family goes back a ways in Alexandria. Judge Dawkins is probably a little bit more Alexandrian than me, but I was born in Alexandria Hospital and have lived here most of my life. So I definitely have a connection to the community. My wife and I live in Old Town Alexandria, not too far from St. Paul's. So I grew up here. I went to public school. I went to Lyles Crouch. I went to GW. I went to TC Williams, as it was called then, and graduated from there. And for those of you who might recognize my last name, my father was the principal at TC. He was there for a very long time. He then became a deputy superintendent in the school system and retired from the school system in 2008. And he's still active because Dr. Hutchings is one of his former students. And Dr. Hutchings and him have a very close friendship. And he advises Dr. Hutchings on a regular basis about school issues and community issues. So I've got a lot of ties to the community here. I've been in our office now for almost 20 years as a prosecutor. I started as the traffic prosecutor. I've got an extensive amount of trial experience. I've tried a lot of very complicated cases over the years. But my job now as the elected Commonwealth's attorney is really a little bit more administrative, setting philosophies and policies for the office, hiring, disciplining, and then obviously speaking publicly, because not only am I a lawyer, I'm also an elected politician. However, I swear you can trust me. I honestly, I promise that you can trust me. So in any event, as the elected prosecutor, I've got a lot on my plate. I don't go to court that frequently anymore. So one of the questions that Michael brought up, I think, is I've identified publicly as a progressive prosecutor. I belong to a group of progressive prosecutors. The question is, what does that mean exactly? What do you mean when you say that? And I think at its simplest, it means that as an elected prosecutor, if I want to espouse progressive ideals, it means that I have to accept, first of all, that there are disparities in the system. There is unfairness in the system. I have to admit that to my employees. I have to adopt philosophies and try to inculcate a culture in the office that are designed to the extent that we can to reduce those disparities and to try to address them with the hopes, hopefully at some point in the future, of eliminating them. It means that I have to adopt a different philosophy as a prosecutor. I think the traditional central casting, paradigm of a prosecutor is someone who is very ambitious, whose job is to seek convictions in all cases, and who gauges their success by conviction rates and the amount of years that they get in prison for a criminal defendant. That's not my philosophy. I try to push back on that kind of central casting vision of what a prosecutor is supposed to be. Instead, we are supposed to be, and I'm not saying that we, even in my office, always reach the ideal, but we are supposed to be ministers of justice, and we are supposed to seek just results. Now, sometimes in a serious case, if someone's been murdered, I mean, that might compel us to seek a conviction on a very serious offense and maybe even advocate for a substantial period of incarceration. But the reality of it is the vast majority of people that come before my office are not hardened criminals. Even the ones that may have committed a violent offense, very, very frequently are they beyond hope and beyond rehabilitation. And so it's really incumbent upon me as a prosecutor who espouses a different viewpoint on how we're supposed to do our job to try to inculcate that culture with the younger people in my office. And I've got a very young office. I've got a lot of young people that have been hired recently. I think depending on how the philosophy in the office is nurtured, you can have a situation where younger people don't understand that, and where they see it as an us versus them type of environment, an adversarial process in which one determines whether or not you've quote unquote won a case by whether or not you've gotten a conviction and how long you've put somebody in prison. So what do I mean about that? Well, so for instance, in Alexandria, we don't keep conviction rate statistics. I in no way, shape, or form are evaluations of employees based on how many convictions they obtain, or even indeed no statistics about how many felony cases or misdemeanor cases they prosecute. Instead, it's more about buying into the office philosophy and using our authority as prosecutors, both wisely, judiciously, hopefully thoughtfully. All right, so that there's a whole lot that goes into that, and some of it's beyond the ambit of this conversation tonight. And I obviously don't want to, overextend my time. I want to give Damon an opportunity to speak from his perspective and his viewpoint, and then open it up for some questions. But I will talk briefly about some specific policies that I've enacted or that my office has adopted over the years. So first of all, it started many years ago, but some of the stuff actually made some differences. I very early on adopted a position where we were not going to argue for cash bail in any shape, way, or form in any case. And that's because I don't believe that cash bail accomplishes the goals that are it's supposed to accomplish. So my office never recommends cash bail in any case, or at least they're not supposed to. Instead, the presumption is that we're going to have release, and that we're going to try to seek pretrial supervision perhaps where necessary. And only in really serious violent cases will be seeking any type of pretrial detention. I point out that we don't make that decision. The decision as to whether to release somebody or what kind of bail to put on someone is by the judges. But I do think our office's policy, it does go a long way. It does help the judges make that determination, and so I'm proud of that policy. Over the last couple of years, we've adopted a couple of very important programs. We have a mental health initiative. Hand in hand with that, we have the Alexandria Treatment Court. I can't take, or my office cannot take sole responsibility for either of those programs. They require a whole great group of wonderful people working together to try to accomplish their goals. But we are a substantive part of both of those programs. And what those programs are designed to do is to address the fact that many of the people that come before the court have either substance abuse problems or mental health problems, or frequently both. I'm sure that all of those of us that have been in the system have seen that on a frequent basis. And what I really love about these two programs is that we actually seek out underrepresented communities, indigent people, communities of color, people with lengthy criminal records. People of means are going to have their own capabilities to get mental health treatment or to get substance abuse treatment. But people who are indigent or people who have lengthy criminal records may not have access to that kind of treatment. And so the fact that these particular programs are designed to seek underserved communities and to try to get people the treatment that they need to kind of address the root problems of crime, that really is a very impressive and a very encouraging a set of criteria in selecting people to participate. And the only problem with these two programs is that we just don't have enough capacity. Currently, the Mental Health Initiative has something like 12 to 14 people in it, and I believe the Substance Abuse Treatment Court has 6 to 8. Hopefully, we're going to be able to increase that number a little bit, but I can assure you that helping a total of 20 or even 25 or 30 people just barely dents the population of human beings that need some help with mental health treatment and substance abuse treatment. And then one other thing I will point out is earlier this year, the legislature, which has made a lot of very needed changes in the criminal system over the past 18 months to 2 years, really enhanced the ability for diversion of criminal offenses. And so my office has recently adopted a much more robust diversion program, which is designed to get people either hopefully to avoid a conviction whatsoever where possible, or at the very least to decrease the severity of the charge that they're facing in exchange for some type of restorative justice, restitution, and probation. So we're trying. I think we've made a big improvement over the past 5 or 6 years as I've had a better understanding of the authority that is inherent in my position, and when I've had a better understanding of our ethical responsibilities, which are very important to me, and as I've had a better understanding as a leader of how to try to inculcate the right culture with the younger people down the chain. But I'm not foolhardy, and I don't submit for any for even 1 second that we've accomplished everything that needs to be accomplished. There are still a lot of issues that need to be addressed. There's still a lot of work to do, and that's why it's really important to have concerned citizens like the people on this call who are interested in these topics and who really want to get involved and to help. And I think by the end of this discussion, my panel mates and me hopefully will give you some concrete ideas about how you might be able to help. And I'll just finish by once again thanking the St. Paul's community for the opportunity to speak tonight. And with that, Michael, I'd like to cede the floor to my colleague, Mr. Colbert.
Great. You know, one of the things that's really cool about our panel is that it's like a virtual courthouse that we've got at St. Paul's. So we've got, you know, up on the bench, we've got our 2 judges. Over here, we've got at the prosecutor's table. We also have a very talented defense attorney, Damon Colbert. I'll ask you the same question I asked the rest of the panel, which is, paint us a picture of what systemic racism looks like at our courthouse and in courthouses across America.
Okay, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here. I will get straight to the point. I practice in about 13 courthouses, one of which is the Alexandria courthouse at 520 King Street, as well as the federal courthouse. Here's what it looks like. Here's what systemic racism may mean at the courthouse. When I walk in the courthouses, no matter if it's in Alexandria or Petersburg, Virginia, I see more Black people than I do any other race in there as the accused, as criminal defendants. I'm usually only in criminal courtrooms. Back when I used to represent a lot of indigent people, when I was on a court-appointed list in multiple courts, no 2 cases are alike. However, my indigent, Black, and Latino clients tended to not do as well as some of my more well-to-do clients. I can think of 3 or 4, in getting prepared for this, I was thinking about just some of my experiences over the last 5 years. Again, no 2 cases are alike, but I've gotten some wonderful results for some well-to-do like housewives and things who did awful things that if they were, I believe, a poor person from the burg. Oh, well, let me not use Alexandria because I have a nice thing to say about Alexandria's prosecutor's office here shortly. But if they were a poor person from a poor part of Arlington, let's say, they wouldn't have gotten the same outcome. So I can think of some very real situations. Today, I was in the Riverside Regional Jail, and I got some access that typically people don't get, especially during COVID. And when I looked around that regional jail, I saw so many young Black men. And when I went to see my client, I mean, this was a kid who was in college 2 weeks ago, and he is in a very rough place now. And I can tell you that my wealthy white clients, you know, they tend to get bail. You know, it's a big difference. That's what I'm seeing here in the trenches. And the one nice thing I wanted to say about the prosecutor that you have here in the city of Alexandria is because I practice so widely, I get to compare and contrast. And I will say this, and this is not just because he's here. I say this not in his presence. I don't talk to a lot of prosecutors, but I believe that the city of Alexandria's prosecutor's office is the most ethical office that I, you know, deal with. I mean, I see some awful stuff. I'm dealing with some awful stuff now. And this was going years back. There are a few prosecutors in that office who, you know, when we defense lawyers are talking about, you know, who we've had good experiences with, whether, you know, I do a lot of trials. I don't do a lot of pleas. So, but just the ethical, how they handle themselves. And then there's a new prosecutor in that office that started somewhere else. And I learned something from him on a case involving a Black man. And it was just a disclosure that I don't think I would have gotten out of any of these other offices where I practice. And I was just so impressed that I got that. And it's going to be helpful to this man's case. So on the margins, I think the Alexandria office is, you know, working against this systemic racism. And again, I'm not saying that because Mr. Porter's on the line, but I live in Alexandria. I've lived here for 21 years. You should know that as prosecutors' offices go, this is a pretty good one.
Actually, yeah, I'd like to sort of riff on that a little bit and talk about Mr. Porter, who is one of the progressive prosecutors for justice. He talked a little bit about that in his opening, but I want to circle back to that because it's relevant to the topic of our discussion, because they have been pressing in Richmond, lobbying for criminal justice reform, serious criminal justice reform. And sort of when they were created, I was kind of curious. I mean, they were sort of doing what associations normally do. And there is an association for Commonwealth's attorneys, but that association was not pressing for these criminal justice reforms. Brian, talk about the creation of this group about a year ago, I suppose, and sort of, I don't want to say you're frustrated with these. I don't want to say you're frustrated with the association, but the association was not pressing for these criminal justice reforms, right? Like you and these, I think there are 11. Is that accurate? 11. Okay. You and these other 10 prosecutors are a small group. You know, the association has 120 prosecutors. You're a member of a much smaller group of 11 prosecutors that are pressing for things the association is not pressing for, right? Walk us inside of that.
Well, I think if you look nationwide to start with, over the past couple of years, there's been a realization by many voters that elected district attorneys have a great deal of authority in local jurisdictions and can make impacts in a way that perhaps a legislature has to be a little bit slower in making those same impacts. And with that came a lot more political activity and a lot more political attention to prosecutors' races. And that has resulted in the Northern Virginia region and also in the more populous regions of Virginia, Tidewater and the Richmond area, with the election of progressive prosecutors, many of whom don't even come from a prosecutorial background. I mean, I'm kind of the outlier in that I have a great deal of experience in the office. And you've got people who do not believe that the old school, law and order, broken windows, enforcing the prosecution of lower level offenses is the right way of doing it. And, I think as an elected official, the reason we are elected is we have an opportunity and an obligation to represent the community that we are elected to represent. So I've got to understand what the community expects. And the community in Alexandria has very clearly told me that they expect us to wield our authority with kindness, wherever possible, with thoughtfulness in every case. And along with that, to get to your question, Michael, there are a great deal of similarly situated and with regards to philosophy prosecutors in the Northern Virginia region. So you've got Fairfax, you've got Arlington, Prince William, and Loudoun at the very least. And then you've got some other members of our group, as I pointed out, the Tidewater area and the Richmond area. And if you add up the population for the 11 of us that are in that group, the population we represent, it is almost 45%, if I've got my numbers straight, of all of the population in Virginia. And so we felt very strongly that because of our communities and because of the amount of citizens that we represented, that if we put together a unified voice to talk about the need for changes in the system, that we could have a real impact. And there's no way, shape, or form that I think the group could take credit for the impact, or I'm sorry, for the changes over the past 18 to 24 months. But I do believe that we were part of that, and I think that's important. And so that's kind of the background of the group.
So I want to come back to the disparities. We talked about being in the courthouse and seeing more Black faces in our local courthouse, but courthouses across the country. And I want to disabuse the audience of any notion that Alexandria is somehow different or somehow better. If you look at the statistics here in Alexandria, Black people are about 23% of the population, but most arrests here in Alexandria are of Black people. Most cases of use of force are against Black people. Most drug arrests are of Black people. Half of the inmates in the jail are Black people. So there is sort of systemic disparity. And I would like to ask Judge Rideout, you went through several reforms that you saw in your time, clearly making things better, and you sort of walked us through that. And yet we still have a long way to go here. Do you have any thoughts in terms of ways that you think these disparities might be addressed?
Hard question. I guess what I'll do is I'll maybe talk a little bit about where I am now on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And a lot of what you are talking about Alexandria is even greater here. What we are trying to do through a number of groups that I'm working with is to address school issues that are being ignored and have been ignored generationally here. We have a school system that has been routinely 22nd, 23rd out of 24 in accomplishments in the state of Maryland. Children who are not getting diplomas, who can't find jobs, who are being set up to fall into the criminal justice system. So what I'm doing here, and possibly what might be done in Alexandria, would be you have to look more at prevention and early intervention programs. You have to look at the Alexandria Tutoring Consortium, and people need to go out and help those kids to learn how to read so they can have success in school, so that they're feeling good about themselves, that there are people that need to mentor children. We're interestingly here, I have they have a truancy court with 75 kids in it, and I'm told by the magistrate judge here that they could have 200 kids in that program, except they can't take that many in. And it's a school, and it's a student body of 5,000 children, half of what, or probably less than half of what is in Alexandria. So Judge Dawkins and I, during our time on the bench, looked at prevention, early intervention. How do we not be a reactive court, but be a proactive court outside of the courtroom to engage the community in ways that we can avoid children and families coming into the court system. That to me is the best way that you can change the number of people that are being arrested by the police, coming into the courthouse, potentially going to jail.
So I want to also talk about one of the significant reforms to come out of the General Assembly just recently, the legalization of marijuana, which of course has been, at the center of the war on drugs. And I want to ask Judge Dawkins about the legalization of marijuana. You have seen these criminal prosecutions at the juvenile domestic relations level, at the circuit court level. How do you think this reform is going to change things in terms of systemic racism with the justice system here in Alexandria?
Well, certainly it starts from the very outset of when a police officer comes on the scene and he observes something that is obviously in his or her mind a criminal offense, possession of marijuana. Now, he or she can make a decision at that time. What do I do? Do I arrest, or do I kind of make a decision not to arrest? And I think that decision has been made probably far too many times when the person's color is involved. And I think that with the legalization of marijuana, I'm not a proponent of either legalization or illegal, but I think that it has been, over the years, it has been used so many times to the disadvantage of African Americans to the extent that it should not have been. And I think that we look at how we compare that with other crimes in the city. This new legislation, as it is proposed, will give some some insight into how the disparity has operated over the course of the past several years.
Could I, Michael, let me add to that?
Please.
I remember soon after I went on the bench, I gave a talk at St. Paul's about the juvenile court and raised the issue of legalization of marijuana and talked about it and talked about how it needed to be part of a conversation. And after I finished, Judge Ellis, the district court judge, came up to me and said, "Oh, you can't be talking like that way. You can't be suggesting that this be legalized. It's not going to happen. It's going to ruin the world." So what, 20 years, 30 years ago, I was talking about that issue. Again, not in the context that I wasn't necessarily looking at it as a black-white issue, but an issue that we shouldn't be going after people for this kind of a crime. It's because it just wasn't a crime.
Damon, do you have any thoughts on the influence of legalization of marijuana and what kind of effects that might have on systemic racism at courthouses across Virginia?
I agree with Judge Dawkins. I mean, I think it's going to, that's usually people's entryway into the criminal legal system. So, to use a trite phrase, the jury's still out. I don't know of how many cases I've had that started off with like a simple, this guy was smoking marijuana and then they find a gun or, and it's just a parade of horribles. So I guess in that sense, this is very new. I'm frankly shocked to see Virginia do it because they were making so much money in the courts off of court fees and things with people being prosecuted for simple possession of marijuana. But I think it's too new to tell. I mean, I think that there will be other reforms that will have a hard-hitting impact more quickly than that one. It's just, it remains to be seen.
I'm glad you said that because there's a lot of reforms that have been accomplished and there are some that haven't. So I just want to go through my scorecard here real quickly in terms of criminal justice reforms that recently come out of the General Assembly: marijuana legalization, ending the death penalty, banning no-knock warrants, getting rid of pretextual policing. In other words, being able to stop someone for the smell of marijuana or even having something dangling from your rearview mirror. The code of police have a code of conduct. There's police training. There are mental health crisis teams. So that's all been accomplished. Then there's things that have not been accomplished. Brian Porter, I want to ask you about this list of things that have not been accomplished. Chokeholds have not been banned. They were limited, but they were not banned. Qualified immunity is still out there. The cash bail system, you mentioned that you don't recommend to judges cash bail, but the system still exists in courthouses across Virginia. Mandatory minimums, which is part of that tough on crime 90s approach that Judge Rideout was talking about. Private prisons. There's one private prison here in Virginia. It still exists. And then also, Brian Porter, something I know that you and I have talked about before, which is defelonizing drugs, so that when you are prosecuted for any kind of drug crime, that it's not a felony. I just listed a bunch of stuff, but I want your scorecard, Brian Porter. You've been there in Richmond lobbying virtually, I guess, over the last year. Talk about what you have seen come out of the General Assembly that you've liked and what you'd like to see them do next.
Well, first of all, I would agree with Damon. It's not just with marijuana. It's been surprising to see a great deal of these reforms come out of the legislature. Because for a long time, the legislature was where criminal reform went to die. But some of the things, I mean, there's even more, Michael, reforms that have come out of the assembly recently that for people that are in the system working on it, like Damon and me and the judges, have a big impact. And a great example of that is the elimination of jury sentencing. Virginia was one of the very few number of states, I think there's 2 or 3 other states that continue to have a system in which after, if a jury returned a conviction, the jury was asked to recommend a sentence to the court. And the reality of it is the jury was asked to recommend a sentence, but they were given almost no information about how to do that in a fair or just manner. And so that really ended up, and it's a very complicated topic, but it ended up, I believe, for the defense bar, often was a bar towards them wanting to exercise trial rights. And so that's a huge change, which has just recently gone into effect. And I don't think we've really felt the impact yet because COVID has decreased the frequency of jury trials recently, although that's slowly ramping back up. Some of the things that you mentioned are like kind of beyond my area of expertise. My group has advocated for reform of mandatory minimum sentences. I think that's an avenue that we could explore. There was at least one other topic there that I thought was interesting. I mean, I'd like to see the elimination of the cash bail system in its entirety. But I have to be, again, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But there has been a huge amount of change in the past 18 months, and that doesn't make everything okay. And it won't automatically make disparities in the system disappear overnight. But I do think we have to be thankful for the amount of change that has occurred. And I do think that many of those reforms are going to have a real impact on how things occur in our courthouse.
So for the viewers, we are taking questions in the chat in Zoom, and we have a question for Mr. Colbert, sort of on this topic that what we're just talking about, which is what reforms would you like to see? I mentioned the ones that were successful. Brian added some ones that were successful and ones that have not been successful. What would you like to see the General Assembly do?
I'm just so happy with jury sentencing going away. Let me just unpack that a little bit from the defense lawyer standpoint. What that's going to do, probably on July the 1st, 2021, I think that's when it becomes effective, is a lot of people who weren't going to trial are now going to go to trial. And that's going to tie into a concrete recommendation I'll have for you at the end of this program. And that's going to stiffen the spine of a lot of defense lawyers who were scared to have jurors sentence their clients. So I believe in the jury system. It's the best system in the world. I can remember my comparative law classes back from law school 20 years ago. It is nothing better than to have 12 people in a felony case or 7 people in a misdemeanor case weigh in and decide what happened and, whether or not this person is guilty or innocent. And that is the best thing that has happened. The second best thing, and it's not so much something I'm proposing. I think one thing, Mr. Porter, I didn't hear it mentioned, but on July 1st, 2021, what we call the presumption against bail for certain offenses, that's going to go away, which means that a lot of people are held pre-trial now just because they happen to be charged with a certain type of crime, they are now going to have a better opportunity to not be held pre-trial for a long length of time where they sort of erode and wear down in jail, and they're going to be able to mount a robust defense while they're hopefully, sleeping in their own beds, eating their own food. It's just a much different situation to fight a case from outside than when you're inside, living in, really horrible conditions. So those two things are just tremendous. I mean, I was very shocked to see what the General Assembly did. I never thought I would see the legalization of, small amounts of marijuana. I never thought I would see jury sentencing go away, but it is earth shattering.
So I want to walk down memory lane a little bit with our two judges here, if I can. Judge Dawkins, we talked a little bit about your background with going to segregated schools. You ended up graduating from a desegregated school. Talk about going, I mean, we're talking about systemic racism. You actually went to a segregated school. You went to Parker Gray initially, right? And then graduated from George Washington High School.
That's correct.
Talk about that experience.
It was a very unique experience in that you walked into, I think many times you walk into your classroom and you felt a sense of not being welcomed at that time by many of your fellow students. Now, I will suggest to you, however, that over the course of time, I felt very welcome at the end of my school career. I was on the basketball team, and believe it or not, I was one of the few African Americans who wasn't very good at basketball. I was okay, but I was still on the basketball team, and I think that for many times I was accepted more because I was an athlete than I was a student, and quite frankly, I wasn't the greatest student, but I made it through, and I was able to graduate and do all the things that I ultimately was able to do. But was it a time in my life where I felt that this was a good experience for me? The answer is no. It wasn't a great experience, because every day it was very uncomfortable, because kind of going into some of those classrooms, knowing that I was not necessarily welcome being there. If you've had the experience of that perhaps only two of the panel members have right now, that we've had over the course of our lives, if you've never gone into a store and been followed from the time you get in the store until the time you leave, that's pretty heavy kind of consequence of your race. So many things that we have had to experience in the course of our lives has been such that we have been measured not necessarily by the quality of who we are, but the color of the skin that we possess. So do I find that it was a great experience going to the high school that I went to? I found that it was an experience that I wouldn't have given up, but however, it was an experience that perhaps, given the opportunity, maybe I would have had second choices, second thoughts about doing it if I had to do it over again. And I think that ultimately it helped me in terms of where I ultimately wound up in my career. But more importantly, it helped me kind of define who I was, not only as a person, but as a student.
And Judge Rideout, in your opening comments, you talked about something that grabbed my attention, which had to do with sort of the ethos in the 1990s. There was this sort of tough on crime atmosphere. And that was a time when the General Assembly created a bunch of mandatory minimum sentences. And these are still around. They're still in the books. Many people want to get rid of these things. And the General Assembly has tried and failed to do this a number of times. In this most recent session, not to get too much into the weeds, but the House passed a bill to get rid of the mandatory minimums. The Senate passed a bill to get rid of the mandatory minimums, and then they could not agree. So the whole thing just sort of fell apart at the last minute. But Judge, you were talking about how that ethos of tough on crime 1990s kind of created a problem. What's been your experience with mandatory minimums? What would you say to a lawmaker in Richmond who is trying to determine whether or not they wanted to get rid of these things?
Well, I think you have to judge these cases on not necessarily the nature of the offense, but the nature of the person involved. I mean, you go back to the crack cocaine versus regular cocaine cases, and I think it was Teddy Kennedy that was the main mover of making the difference and making crack cocaine a more punishable offense, which was something that the African-American community who was selling drugs was selling as opposed to the regular cocaine, so that there was discrimination in that wound up with Tracy Fells and others getting significant sentences that might not have been the case had it simply been a different type of cocaine. With our court, we were, we could detain youth pre-trial in the detention home, could sentence youth up to 30 days in the detention home. If we move them on to circuit court, the circuit court could treat them as a juvenile for some of the case and also do an adult sentence. They could split the sentence. It seems to me that you have to have that kind of flexibility to make a just decision about the person who's in front of you and the nature of the offense that they have been convicted of.
Damon Colbert, Brian Porter, any other thoughts about mandatory minimums or the efforts to get rid of them?
Well, one of the things that I think is true, and I'm sure, well, I shouldn't say I'm sure, but I would assume that Damon would agree with me, is that mandatory minimums have given prosecutors' offices a lot of authority, a lot of leverage in plea negotiations and trying to basically get people to give up the opportunity of availing themselves of their constitutional right to trial. Now, my office, I've always tried to limit, the idea that we would load someone up with a bunch of mandatory minimum offenses and then null process a bunch of them in exchange for a plea. But there's no doubt that the proliferation of mandatory minimum offenses has kind of changed the calculus a little bit. When a defense attorney is talking to his or her client about whether or not they should go to trial. So that's one of the main reasons why I think it's right for us to look at mandatory minimums, to advocate for reform, because I think it's been used not judiciously and not fairly by many of my colleagues over the years in the past. And I think that's one of the reasons why we need to take a hard look at them.
Damon Colbert, any thoughts?
I agree with you. Said it better than I could have said it.
So a question here from the audience. Do local courts go into high school civics classes to describe criminal and civil court system? I think the person asking the question is thinking like, television actually shapes a lot of the perceptions of this sort of stuff. Is this something that students are learning about, or should they learn about it more? Any thoughts on that? I guess Judge Rideout would be the place to start there.
I know we used to do it on law day, and I assume that continues, where the Bar Association and judges would go and give talks to students at the high schools and middle schools. And I remember doing it at other times where teachers would invite me to come and make presentations to their class about juvenile justice and whatnot. So it clearly is something that, if it's not being done, it certainly needs to be done.
Any other thoughts about sort of students and civics education?
Actually, I'm not sure the name of the program, but just last week, several lawyers around the city were all participated in a program with T.C. Williams high school civic classes, and they spoke all day to those classes regarding issues regarding whatever they wanted to talk about, but as it related to the law. So it happened as recent as last week.
So, so we've talked about mandatory minimums, and I mean, that's going to be an issue that's going to be talked about a lot next year when the General Assembly meets. There's another issue that I want to get into: qualified immunity, which sounds kind of complicated, but essentially if an officer does something egregiously wrong that he or she might be sort of sued. I think that's a simplified way of looking at it. But this is something that a lot of people have wanted to get rid of, these protections for law enforcement officers. There's a lot of resistance to that, and it hasn't happened yet. This is something you will be hearing about on the campaign trail. The candidates are talking about this and taking positions on this. Brian Porter, what's your position on qualified immunity?
Well, qualified immunity is a civil doctrine that involves civil lawsuits, and that's outside the scope of my expertise. And I really try to focus on the things that directly impact my office. I honestly have not studied the issue in any great detail. So I don't really have a position on it. I think it's something more for the city attorney to have a position on, for the police department to have a position on, because it's going to directly impact them. As you know, my office focuses on criminal charges alone. So that's kind of the silo I'm in and where I'm focusing my attention.
Damon Colbert, any thoughts on the debate over qualified immunity as it's going to play out on the campaign trail this year?
My only thoughts are, I mean, would I like to see it go? Yes, but practically speaking, you have police officers leaving departments in droves now. And if you give them that type of exposure, I just don't see how it will play out practically. I mean, I sort of follow it. I have a matter going on now where I'm bumping up against it. You know, I think there's one thing for politicians to talk about it, and it's another thing for the United States Supreme Court to either change its position or fashion some new made up, you know, because qualified immunity was, you know, just made up out of whole cloth, out of court. But then practically speaking, what does it mean when officers are exposed? Who's really going to do that tough job that doesn't pay a lot of money? And I understand there are a plethora of problems. It's a lot for us to tackle as a society, but that's sort of where I come down. Like, what does this mean practically?
So one of the accomplishments that did happen this past year was the ability to expunge criminal records. So if you've got an old criminal offense on your record, maybe like a marijuana offense from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that you could get it expunged or sealed, or, you know, basically that it wouldn't cause a problem if you were trying to get a job or trying to get housing. And there were a lot of talk and debate about the best way to do that, whether or not it should be automatic. In other words, you don't need to hire a lawyer, you don't need to go to court, or that it would be petition based. And so there's a lot of fighting among Democrats about the best way to do that. The automatic approach was favored mainly by the House members, and the senators wanted a petition based approach. During that debate, Brian Porter said something I thought was really interesting, because we were drawing distinctions here between the kinds of offenses that would be automatic versus the ones that would be petition based. And that's kind of came down to, is it a felony or not? And, you know, in discussing that with you, Mr. Porter, you said something I thought was really interesting, which is, why are any crimes a felony? Why are any drug crimes a felony offense? And you said something I thought was really interesting, which is maybe we should think about defelonizing all drug offenses. Explain that, and how that might tie into our discussion here of battling systemic racism.
Well, yeah, I mean, I remember that conversation. I'm glad you brought that up again, because that's the point you made earlier that we were going to talk about. So I want to make it clear, what I'm talking about, at least, is not all drug offenses being defelonized. It's possession offenses and maybe some very minor distribution offenses. Now, you know, one could have a good discussion and debate. We could probably do an hour and a half about whether there should be any drug offenses whatsoever. And I think that perhaps there are some very good points to be made that, you know, all drugs should be decriminalized. But I don't think we're ready as a society for that because we don't have any real societal push to address the very myriad issues that would arise if we were to immediately do that. On the other hand, it has always been a question to me, even as a young prosecutor, before I really thought about these things the way I think about them now. Back in the the mid 2000s when I was back in the trenches and really doing a great volume of trials. Now I just push papers around my desk, but even then it was odd to me that we felonized simple possession of drugs. So in other words, someone who arguably is addicted to heroin or to cocaine, whether it's crack cocaine or powder cocaine, if they were arrested, let's say for a very minor offense, and the officer incident to arrest searched them and located one tablet of Schedule 1 or 2 substance, or one individual dose of crack cocaine or powder cocaine. The only charge that would pertain in those circumstances is a felony, a Class 5 felony. And under current law, they're allowed one bite at the apple to avoid a felony conviction. But then after that, they would be convicted of a felony if they were arrested again for it and suffer all of the adverse collateral consequences that go along with having a felony conviction. And so I believe what we were talking about, Michael, was the idea of the assembly looking at defelonizing possession of drugs and making all of those offenses a Class 1 misdemeanor. There was not very much movement on that in the past assembly, but maybe that is something that will be reintroduced in the future.
Any other panelists want to jump in on that before we move on to the next thing? Okay, hearing none. So we're bumping up against 9 o'clock. Time flies when you're having fun. I am going to ask all of our panelists to give us some concrete suggestions, action steps that members of St. Paul's can do to reduce, eliminate, cut down on, battle systemic racism in criminal and civil justice. And I'm going to start with Judge Dawkins.
I was certain you were going to start with Judge Dawkins. But I think the reality is, it's an example that Steve Rideout gave us yesterday when we spoke day before yesterday about an experiment that he was involved in. And I wish he would kind of briefly share it with you when he gets an opportunity to speak. But the bottom line is that we have to acknowledge that, in fact, racism exists, systemic or otherwise. And once we are kind of focused on the existence of racism, we have to understand that each of us can do a part in not exercising what you or I believe can be harmful to another human being. And to that extent, I would just hope that each of you will go back wherever you are from or whatever community you're in. And the next time you experience something that you believe you have done, or you see something that's being done that would be harmful to another human, that you will kind of take a step back and say, that's not right.
Judge Rideout.
I can't remember what I told Nolan the other day. So, remind me, and I'll be happy to talk about it. What I have given to Elizabeth a list of links to a variety of programs in Alexandria, again, for which some of them need contributions. The Beat the Odds program is just a fabulous program that the Bar Association is doing to give scholarships to kids who have been court involved and have turned their lives around. The girls program, Space of Her Own, it's been 95% successful in diverting girls who were headed to court, out of court, and giving them mentors who have created lifelong friendships with these girls, women who are interested in remaking the girls' space at home. Here on the Eastern Shore, I'm working on a program with a nonprofit foundation, the Live Foundation out of Fairfax, Virginia, actually, that is helping to create programs similar to the Alexandria Tutoring Consortium that will help kids to be reading on grade level by the 3rd grade. There's so many things out there. The Act for Alexandria has just a whole group of different kinds of programs that it supports. If you go on their website, and I've given that to Elizabeth as well, find out what interests you. Is it housing? Is it reduction of crime? Is it kids? Is it mentoring? Whatever. There are programs out there that can help to prevent and intervene early in the lives of children and families, and in doing that will help reduce involvement in the criminal justice system.
All right. And Brian Porter, so you spoke for 4 hours earlier today, and you've given us an hour and a half or 2 hours, which we really appreciate. So wrap it up here with a 4-hour speech.
Yeah, I'm lucky I didn't fall asleep, Michael. Thank you. So I think, well, the first step is caring about these issues and wanting to learn about them and being willing to accept and being willing to have difficult conversations and maybe listen to the concepts that make you feel a little uncomfortable about your own role in society, your own place, and your own privilege. That's a first step. But obviously it's not sufficient to affect change. It can affect change maybe internally somewhat, each individual human being accepting that racism exists and that we have an obligation to try to make the world a better place. But the next step, of course, is what do you do about that once you're willing to accept it and you've learned about it? One of the things that I think is really important is to be civically engaged. And really, I'm going to talk about elections here because that's something that really matters to me. I'm not talking politics. I'm not here to make a political speech. But what I mean is that everyone gets very fired up about presidential elections, and of course they're important. But I would advocate for people to take the position that state and local elections impact their citizens' lives in a more direct way than probably the presidential election. And there's definitely not as much interest in state and local elections. There's political groups that get very active on that and are very into it. And I can understand that. People have a lot going on in their lives. But if you really care about the issues and you want to see change, it's important to elect leaders that are also willing to make change and to address these very difficult issues. So I would advocate for that. Sometimes it can mean watching city council debates, and that's not necessarily always riveting, but it's also very important to understand what's going on in the city council chamber, because that can directly impact what's going on with citizens here in the city. And then finally, I would say be active. Okay, be active in your church. That's a very important part. Be active in the community. Be active in youth sports. Be active in mentoring. Be active in any group in which we are kind of increasing the civic literacy of the city and increasing the critical mass of people that want to make change and want to be part of the solution. And that can include volunteering where it's possible for you. It can include making financial contributions to great organizations, some of which Judge Radat has mentioned. I would also mention Guest House here in Alexandria is a very worthy charity. I'm not saying it's more worthy than others, but it's a group that I've had a lot of close relationship with over the years, and I think it's a really important organization. And then finally, be willing, as I think Judge Dawkins said, if you see something unjust occurring, if you see injustice, don't turn your eyes away from it and walk away. Okay, maybe not confront the person, but there's always something you can do, something that you could do to try to address the injustices that do occur. And if everyone just takes that as is kind of a commandment that they're going to try to make a little bit of a difference in the world, we'll make some incremental progress towards a more inclusive and more just society.
And Damon Colbert, any concrete action items that viewers can take and incorporate?
Yes, sir. During the opening prayer, I believe the pastor used the phrase, agents of justice. Here's how you can be a good agent of justice. Number one, when you get that juror summons, go with the open mind. and listen, because to me, there's no higher form of civic engagement than serving on a jury. Elections are terribly important. That takes me to my next point. Support. If you live here in the city of Alexandria, you may or may not know, we don't have body-worn cameras, which in 2021, I think is just woefully bad. They protect officers, they protect citizens. If you're worried about systemic racism, you know, one thing that doesn't lie is that camera footage. And I think with the George Floyd thing, even though that was a civilian film, and you see the importance of video. We don't have that here. I would encourage people to support candidates who will get the funding that we need to have that will fund Mr. Porter's office so that he has the prosecutors to review the footage so that they can ethically fulfill their duties. And the last point is, and this may be, you know, this may be a bridge too far, but I would hope that people will support candidates who express a desire to ensure that lawyers who represent indigent people are paid adequately. People on this call may not know that in Virginia, I think Mississippi and maybe one other state, and please don't quote me on that, it's something I read a while back, but lawyers who represent indigent people in Virginia are woefully underpaid. For instance, back when I used to do it, I would have to do a whole jury trial for like a grand larceny for $450. My hourly rate is north of $450. And so if we're worried about systemic racism, I think many of us have talked about Black people are in the system, brown people are in the system. Those are more than likely going to be the people being represented by woefully underpaid, but sometimes very, very capable lawyers. We should give them adequate pay and adequate resources so that they can, you know, equalize this playing field a little bit more. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I would like to thank the panelists for an excellent discussion. I'd like to thank the viewers for watching, and I'm going to turn it back over to Elizabeth. So thank you.
Wow, thank you all. And thanks to Michael Pope for moderating. I think you could make a city council panel exciting. And thanks to our panel. I'm going to write down these ideas and they'll be included along with this video and the slides at the end. And I think I can also send it out to the folks that registered for this. So those are coming your way. I give thanks for this panel for giving us these glimpses into how the system works. I find some hope here. There's places to celebrate. And of course, there's still some places where we have work to do. And thanks for illuminating all of that. I know I had a little tear in my eye, believe it or not. I was really heartened to see our Commonwealth attorney and a well-known defense attorney agreeing on so many things and being able to be so civil and generous to each other. So you give me real hope in our system. Thank you very much. So a big thanks for your time with us and for your dedication to the city of Alexandria and to doing this really important work that you all are doing. Thank you so much. And now I am going to turn it back over to Joe.
The Lord be with you.
And
also with
you.
Holy Father, thank you for this time, this opportunity, and this time, and these people who've given of their time to teach us and tell us about justice and injustice in our city. Help us as we leave this place to figure out how we can get involved and how we can help change our city and make it a more just place. We ask this in your name. Amen.
Amen.